Today's shiur will begin 5 lines from the top of Daf Tes Zayin. In our previous shiur, we were discussing the use of the dirt, the presence of the dirt that is part of the Sotah process. And today we continue with a discussion related to the issue of Ofar. And on the side of the Gemara, you might notice we have a topic heading which reads Shimush be'efer bimkom Ofar. The use of ash instead of dirt. The two words appear almost the same. One is spelled with an aleph, that's the ash, efer, and dirt with an ayin, ofar. You'll notice we also have a structural note, the mivneh. The Gemara opens up with a question. If you skim down the Omid and in fact continue onto Omid Beis, you'll notice that this geometric form, the volcano shape or trapezoid if you prefer, is going to appear in alternating directions. So under the mivneh heading, we call this a ma'akav. A ma'akav is an attempt to keep track of a type of give and take discussion. The shapes, each one will have a dual purpose. With the narrow part facing upwards, they represent she'elos, questions. Ubahemshech, and as the Gemara continues, they also represent nisyonos lahachshir efer, attempts to show that ash is an acceptable replacement for dirt. The inverted shape will represent tshuvos, responses, and in this case, behemshech, in the continuation of the Gemara, sibos lifsol efer. These are reasons to disqualify Afer as being a replacement for Ofar. In other words, inverted volcano, indicating that ash not acceptable. Just take a bird's eye look at this sugya. The Gemara opens up with a question, and we've noted as a long question: is Afer a suitable replacement for Ofar? Following the long question, and we're trying to navigate by looking at our markings that you see on the immediate right-hand side of the Gemara text, then you see a tshuva, a response. The question was, is Afer, ash, qualify as a replacement for Ofar? Answer, no. And you can see the inverted volcano shape. So essentially, we're answering at that point, not good. The Gemara, after that, you can see a volcano shape, narrow part facing up, saying no, we're going to say that Afer is acceptable. The Gemara having said Tana v'shir. The Tana gives certain examples, but he's not exhaustive, and Afer would also be a good replacement for Ofar. We didn't explain what we meant by left out. That, of course, will become more clear when we get into the Gemara itself. But trying to feel the give and take style of the Gemara, and then following that response of Tana v'shir, that Afer is good, the Gemara challenges that, and you see the inverted volcano saying Umay shir dahai shir. Well, what else was left out? And the Gemara says there is something else that was left out of the list, shir, and then with that we have a long marking, but all of that is designed to show that Afer would be acceptable. Following that long marking that we called shiur, you notice that the volcano once again appears inverted, and on the side of more we say ain shiur. There isn't something that was left out of the list, but the point is that the Afer is not acceptable. That's the thrust of the Gemara that you see 6 lines from the bottom of this Omid. Afer not acceptable. We go to the upper part of Omid Beis. You'll notice several lines from the top of Omid Beis, about 7 lines from the top. Once again, the volcano shape appears narrow facing up, where the Gemara is my havi Allah. Here's a question. Well, what is the din in the final analysis? Can you use Afer or not? The direction taken there is very similar to the beginning of the Gemara. It's a question. Is Afer good? Inverted, and then the Gemara concludes with an inverted volcano shape, Tashmad Yom Rav Huna, and that represents the end of this discussion where the Gemara concludes Afer is not acceptable. So, having experienced, we'll say, the skeleton of the Gemara, the flow of the Gemara, you notice the give and take style. Let's now go to the text itself. 5 lines from the top of Tez Zayin Amud Aleph. Ibaya leho ein sham ofar. Let us say that there was no dirt available. Mahu shitain efer. Can ash be used? And here we have a bracketed section. Let's skip the bracketed section initially. And the question was asked, and as very often appears, there are 2 sides of the question, and that's what you see, and we've noted it with an aleph. Next line at the end, you see O Dilma Beis. 2 sides of the question. On the one hand, Afal Gav the Ikri Afar, even though Afer is called Afar, in other words, that's in the bracketed section, references made to this, the interchangeability of these words, so that even though Afer might be called Afar, and for the Sotah, the Torah speaks about the use of Afar, Hacha bekarka mishkan ksiv. Here, with specifically the case of Sotah, the term karka mishkan appears from the floor of the Mishkan, which would seem to exclude ash. Ash has no relevance to the floor of the Mishkan. Oy dilma, hi bekarka mishkan, or it's possible that the term bekarka mishkan is not a reference to the dirt, but rather L'chdi'isi ben Yehuda, L'chdi'isi ben Menachem hu da'asi. It comes for the teachings that we saw at the bottom of Daf Tes Vav Amid Beis, and at the top here of our Daf that we, at the end of our last shiur, where Isi ben Menachem appear. So that the term Bekarka Mishkan has an alternative role, and not to exclude ash. Now, we skipped the bracketed section within our question. Let's go over it again. Let's start from the beginning of the question. If there's no dirt, can you use ash? According to Beis Shammai, there is no question. The Amri, they say, Lo motzinu efer shekorui ofar. According to Beis Shammai, we don't find efer referred to as ofar. So if Afer is not referred to as Offer and the Torah says, bring Ofar, you can't bring Afer. There's no issue according to Beis Shammai. Kiti boy aloch, aliba de Beis Hillel. The question becomes relevant according to Beis Hillel. And we didn't see Beis Shammai's Hill, so don't be concerned. Well, what are you talking about? Rashi tells us that this Gemara is referring to a machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel that you find in Maseches Chulin regarding the mitzvah of kisui hadam, covering the blood of birds or undomesticated kosher variety animals that were slaughtered, where the Torah says v'chiso ba'afar, and there is a discussion there concerning the use of ash. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai argue. For our purposes, realize that according to Beis Shammai, there is no basis of even raising this question. But kiti boy aloch, we continue in our Gemara liba de Beis Hillel. The Amri, according to Beis Hillel, who says motzinu efer shekorui afar mai, we find in the Torah that in the case of the Porah Duma, it says v'lakhu me afar sreifas achatos. In the context of Porah Duma, which is a procedure of burning a red heifer, its ash being used for the purification of those who were defiled to the dead. And we know that the cow is burnt, and yet the Torah says you take from the ofar of the streifas achatos. The streif is the burning of that particular chatos is the red heifer. But the Torah uses the word ofar dirt, but it's a burnt animal. It's not dirt, it's ash. So what do you see? You see over there that afer, which in reality you're dealing with ash, and the Torah calls it ofar. So the question for us is, in the case of Sotah, where the Torah speaks about ofar, can you use ash? Are they interchangeable? And the Gemara analyzes, Afagav, on the one hand you might say, no, they're not interchangeable here by Sotah. Why? That Afagav the Ikri ofar, even though ash is referred to by the term ofar, Hacha, here by the case of Sotah, Bekarka Mishkan Ksiv. It says you're going to take the offer from the floor of the Mishkan, and that would seem to then disqualify ash having nothing to do with the floor of the Mishkan. Oy Dilma, or possibly Hai Bekarka Mishkan, the role of Karka Mishkan in the Pasuk is not to exclude ash, but rather L'chadi'isi ben Yehuda Uchadi'isi ben Menachem hu da'asi. The role of the term Karka Mishkan is for what Isi ben Yehuda said on Tes Vav Amid Beis, or for Isi ben Menachem says on the top of our Amid. And just to repeat, but not to exclude Afer. So at this point, the question has been raised. Very simply, is Afer qualified as a replacement for Ofar by the Sotah? Ta Shma, and the Gemara answers. We have a long answer, and the thrust of this answer is no, you cannot use Afer. Until we get to that conclusion, we have to go through quite a discussion. Tashma, the Omar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. The dashed underlining of Yishmael will have significance later on. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, B'shloisha mekaymis halacha oikeves mikra. Halacha, it means the oral Torah, the oral tradition. The oral tradition in three realms, three examples, oikeves, uproots mikra, that which the scripture says. And here are the examples. HaTorah Amra be'afar. The Torah says in the mitzvah of kisui hadam, of covering the blood of birds that are slaughtered, you use afar, dirt. The halacha, and the oral law, the Torah Shebal Peh tells us bechol davar. You can use all kinds of materials, so that even though the Torah is very specific, it says be'afar, the oral tradition basically says no, you don't have to use afar, you can use other things. Rashi mentions other substances in which plants can grow, and he gives examples. A second situation, HaTorah Amra, in the case of the Nazir, the case of someone who accepts upon himself the Nazir vow, the abstinence from wine and prohibition of taking haircuts. At the end of the Nazir period, he is to shave his head bitar. Bitar is a razor. V'halacha b'chol davar. And the oral tradition says that the shaving can be, I should say, let me correct myself here. The Torah says that a Nazir is not allowed to take a haircut using a razor. It's true, at the end of the Nazir's period, he removes his hair with a razor, but for the time being, regarding the Isur Tispores, the Torah says he cannot use a razor. And when it comes to the actual law, Valacha b'chol davar, he cannot take haircut with anything, with scissors as well. So the Torah said prohibition is with tar, and the oral tradition uproots that which the Torah says, namely, and the prohibition is with everything. HaTorah Amra, in the case of this third example, in the case of a get, a divorce document, that the husband, when he divorces his wife, he writes out a document, and it says v'kosav lo sefer krisus, and the word sefer, it has a very specific connotation. It's a reference to a document written on a piece of parchment. V'halacha b'chol davar, and when it comes to the oral tradition, the halacha tells us that it can be written on anything. A divorce document is acceptable if it's written on paper, it's written on a wood tablet. So what? According to Rabbi Shmuel, the Torah might say one thing, oral tradition says something else. In our question, we're dealing with Ofar of the Sotah. The Torah says that Ofar, dirt, is to be brought for the Sotah process. Mina Ofar Shiyeh B'karka Mishkan, the Pasuk says in Bamidbar Perek Hey Pasuk Yud Zayin. Our question is, can you use Afer? That would be, we'll say, an undoing of that which the Torah dictates. Does the Sotah example appear in this list? Rabbi Shmuel says in 3 cases the oral tradition undoes what's written in the scripture. It doesn't include Afer as an example. Ve'im Isa, if it were so that Afer is acceptable, lechshiv nami hai, let this also be in a list of examples of mekaymes that the halachas oikeves mikra, where the oral tradition undoes the scripture. So that from the fact that the Sotah ash suggestion doesn't appear, it must be that Afer is unfit. The Gemara says, let's not be so hasty to exclude Afer just because it's not in the list. Tana v'shiur. Tana means he teaches. Rabbi Shmuel teaches a list of things where oral tradition undoes scripture, but he left out v'shiur. He left out the case of Afer. It could have been taught as well. Afer is okay. The Gemara asks, Umay shiur the high shiur. This is a challenge. We have an inverted volcano shape because we're challenging what we just suggested, that the Afer would be okay. When you say that a list is taught but is incomplete, it cannot be termed incomplete by virtue of just one element or one example being left out. If you want to say something is incomplete, there have to be 2 or more examples of things that are left out. Otherwise, if you have just one thing that's left out, it appears to us to be rather deliberate that only this thing was left out. If you say 2 things were left out of the list, so the one making the list didn't want to exhaust all of the examples, so he taught a few but left out others. So inevitably, when you try to give this answer of Tana v'shiur, you're going to have to come up with something else that was left out of the list as well. So, umay shiur the high shiur. What did Rabbi Shmuel leave out of the list in addition to the Afer example by the Sotah that would justify leaving the Afer example out of the list as well? When it says, there is something else that was left out. Shiur mitzorah. Now here we have a long marking indicating something else was left out. When we say something else was left out, that's good for the Afer cause. In other words, if you want to legitimatize Afer for the Sotah, it's important that something else was left out. Well, what's the something else? The something else has to do with the realm of mitzorah. When we get into this section of the law, we might end up losing sight of the forest for the trees. We're going to be discussing details concerning the mitzorah haircut requirements, and we're going to lose a little bit of the flow of the Gemara. So before we get into the details, notice at the end of the long marking, there is once again the volcano shape flips over, narrow part down, and a long marking appears to the side of the Gemara. Once again, ein shiur. This attempt to say that the mitzorah is the additional example that Rabbi Shmuel left out of his list, it's not a good example. And notice that we have then a long marking, ein shiur, and that will take us to the 7th line from the top of Omid Beis. Okay, now we have to delve into the issue of the mitzorah haircut requirements. This we call a tatnos. We have a subtopic heading here: tiglachas sheni de mitzorah. A mitzorah, person who experienced tzoras, a skin discoloration where the skin turns white, and the Torah is full of details in Parshas Tazria, in Sefer Vayikra on the topic. Certainly we're not going to get involved with all of that. All that we have to note for now is that the Torah speaks about the mitzorah taking a haircut, in fact taking 2 haircuts. One's called tiglachas rishon, the other is tiglachas sheni. The first haircut is when the Kohen rules that the tzoras disappeared, and then 7 days later a second haircut is taken. The psukim that describe these haircuts, once again, if you just focus on the psukim themselves, you might find a difference between the haircut taken at the beginning of that week of purification, on the first haircut, versus the Tiglach HaSheni, the second haircut. When you look at the psukim, the Torah says, "Es kol sairo," he is to remove all his body hair, no exception. All body hair is removed. When you say all body hair, it includes even the hair on his arms, on his legs, his underarms. All body hair is removed. When you look at the psukim regarding the second haircut, it's not as inclusive. It's taught in what we call a klal uprat klal fashion. Klal uprat is a structure of psukim that teach something in a general tone, then a specific tone, and then a subsequent general tone. That's called klal is general, prat specific, klal general. Scriptural structure like that indicates that we're willing to include a little bit more than that which is specified in the verse, but we're also excluding things. So I hope you're getting the feeling, at least, that when you look at things scripturally, the haircut number 1 is different than haircut number 2 of the Mitzorah. What is the actual procedure? Meaning what we've referred to before as the halacha, the oral tradition, which is for us the bottom line, the final word. Surprise, surprise. Both haircuts, the second haircut is just like the first haircut, complete hair removal. In our Gemara markings, before we get into the text, we have diamonds that might stand out. One diamond includes the expression mokum kinu seir v'nireh. That's hair that grows in a dense, concentrated fashion and is visible. Hair that grows on one's head as opposed to hair that you find on one's arms. Hair on one's head is kinus, it's gathered together, it grows in a dense fashion. Near means it's visible, let's say, as opposed to hair on the underarms, armpit hair, that's not visible, it's usually covered. There's another diamond, kedalas. Dalas is without committing ourselves to an actual translation, in modern Hebrew, that's not necessarily what the Gemara means, but a dalas is a pumpkin. If you prefer, you can say a bowling ball or a bowling pin, something that creates the image of total smoothness. So that's another kind of haircut, where kedalas, the bowling pin look, complete hair removal. So when you study the topic of Mitzorah, you find what looks like something Rabbi Yishmael was talking about before, about halacha oikeves mikra. The mikra says tiglachas sheni, the second haircut of the Mitzorah, is not all inclusive. Comes along halacha, the oral tradition, and uproots that and says second haircut of the Mitzorah is total hair removal. The last form. If the sugya would end there, so then you go back to the Rabbi Yishmael. He taught 3 examples: kisei adam, nazir, and get, where the halacha is oikeves mikra. Well, but we also, by the case of the Mitzorah, the halacha, the tiglachas sheni, second haircut of the Mitzorah, is oikeves mikra. Whereas the Mikra would have said limited haircut for Tiglachas Sheni Mitzorah, oral tradition says bowling pin haircut for Tiglachas Sheni Mitzorah. Now once I say that Mitzorah is an example of halacha ikeves Mikra, I can add the case of the Afer in the Sotah situation. Let's read this now in the Gemara. Shiur Mitzorah. I hope everyone sees where we are in the text. In the middle of the page, the long marking to the right-hand side of the text, you see shiur. He's saying the Rabbi Yishmael above left out of his list the case of Mitzorah. Tisanya, v'hoya b'yom hashvi'i, on the 7th day of the purification week of the Mitzorah, Yilgalach as kol sairo. the Mitzorah removes all his hair, klal. That's a general statement. But yet the pasuk goes on to say, Es Roshei v'Zikonov es Gaboy Seinov, hair from his head, hair from his beard, and hair from his eyebrows. Prat. Those are specific examples. The pasuk goes on to say, V'es kol Sairo Yigaleach Chazar v'Kolal. The pasuk is saying, and all his hair he shaves off. A general statement. Structurally, what do we have? Klal upratu. Klal, general, specific, followed by general. Iatodon elokein haprat. If you want to include other areas of hair removal, they'll have to be similar to the attributes or the qualifications represented by the specifics. What were the specifics? Head, beard, eyebrows. Mahaprat, mefurash. The Torah, in its specific examples, is teaching explicitly mokom kinuseir v'nireh. Those three parts of the body represent cases where the hair grows in concentration and they're visible. Af kol mokom kinuseir v'nireh. So too, any other part of the body where the hair grows in a concentrated fashion and is also visible. And when we say visible, as opposed to hidden, we're not referring to clothing. We're referring to the body in its natural position. Is the hair visible or not? So, being that the pasuk is in a klal pratu klal fashion, we have a right to include something beyond head, beard, and eyebrows. My Ravi, what else is included as having these qualifications of kinusei v'nireh? Ravi Seir Raglayim. This is a euphemism, so don't just translate this. It's a reference to we call the pubic hairs, literally the hairs of the feet, but the term is Lashon Sagi Nohar, Lishno Ma'alyo. You'll see pleasant speech. We don't instead of referring to it in its direct term, we use a euphemism. So pubic hairs, they grow in concentration and they are visible. Of course, if a person is unclothed, you just look at the person, you can see them. My miyate, what's excluded? What, for example, are hairs that would not be included in on a scriptural level as part of the second Mitzorah haircut requirement? What's excluded? My miyate, what's excluded? Miyate, the beis hashechi u the kule gufe. What's being excluded for the tiglach hasheni of the Mitzorah, armpit hairs. What do they? Armpit hairs grow in concentration. However, they're not immediately visible. That's beis hashechi, armpit hairs. The kule gufe, hairs found on the rest of one's body, arms. That hair is visible, but it doesn't grow in concentration. So scripturally, tiglach hasheni of the Mitzorah, limited hair removal. The hilchasa, the oral tradition, megaleach kedelas disnan, the haircut of the Mitzorah, the second haircut, is actually going to be like his first haircut, and he removes to make himself hair free. Body hair removal, like a bowling pin. Disnan, bo loy lahakif es hamitzorah. This is a source. Right now we're talking about the first haircut, the initial haircut of the Mitzorah. When he comes to shave the head around, mavir tar al kol besoro. So a razor is passed over all of his flesh. The kotani seifa, and it continues to say in the end of that Tanaic source, uvayom hashvi megalcho tiglachas shnia ketiglachas rishona. On the seventh day, that's the seventh day of the purification week, the Mitzorah does his second haircut that is reminiscent, that is similar to tiglachas rishona. So that even though Yom HaShvi, according to the Mikra, was darshaned as a klal pratu klal, which limited me to areas of hair concentration, the oral tradition says, do the second Mitzorah haircut like the tiglachas rishona, like the dalas, like the pumpkin or bowling pin style, complete hair removal. Alright, so what do we have? We have a case of halacha okeves mikra. And if you have Mitzorah as an example that was not stated by Rabbi Shmuel in his original list of 3 items. He left out Mitzora. He might very well then have left out the case of the Afer. Afer then could also be an example of Halacha Keves Mikra, and Afer would be acceptable for Sotah. Ash being acceptable. Rejection. The volcano shape becomes inverted now, and we're going to again focus on the issue, could Afer really have been included in that list? Notice 3 triangles, and on the side of the Gemara, under the Mivneh, the structural note, Deos, Loma, Mitzora, Eino, Nechshav, Shiur. Truth is that Mitzora does not qualify as something left out of Rabbi Shmuel's list. 3 explanations as to why we cannot rely on the absence of Mitzora from his list to justify the absence of Afer from the list. And if we then remove Mitzora from the discussion and then say, well, maybe Rabbi Shmuel left out Afer, but it's leaving out a case of leaving out only one example, and that's not acceptable. So the thrust of this Gemara is to show that in truth Afer would be unacceptable. Now we get into details. Why does Mitzora really not constitute an example of halacha ikeves mikra? Omar Rav Nachmar Yitzchak ki ka chashiv. Chashiv is a word referring to an accounting or a listing. When Rabbi Shmuel made a listing of examples, halacha ikeves mikra, that's a case where oral tradition undid that which is spelled out. Mikra means something that's explicit in the verse. And just by looking back in the Gemara, you can see that in each one of the cases, the oral tradition undid that which was specified in an explicit fashion in those 3 cases of Kisei Adam, Nazir, and Get. The case of the Mitzora, it's true we have an oral tradition undoing something, but keves midarabanan hi. The word midarabanan is a tricky word. Midarabanan often means something that's rabbinic, meaning rabbinic as opposed to something on a Torah level. Here, we're not dealing with something that's of rabbinic origin, but I believe you can use the term, the hermeneutics that appeared here, the klal pratu klal, this method of deriving information through oral tradition in how to view scriptures, that is also called dirabanan, because it involves a tradition that the rabbis had dating back to the giving of the Torah itself. So here we have, we'll say, a conflict between an oral tradition and information that's not explicit in the verses, but information that was derived through klal pratu klal. So that Mitzora doesn't fit into the list of things that Rabbi Shmuel was talking about. Rabbi Shmuel, just to repeat, Rabbi Shmuel spoke about examples where the oral tradition undoes something spelled out explicitly in the verse. Here, the Tiglach HaSheni of the Mitzora, we have an oral tradition undoing something that's derived through klal prat uklal. Rav Papa Omar, ki ka chashiv, halacha oikeves ve'oikeres. Rav Papa says the list that Rabbi Shmuel presented were cases where the oral tradition went around and literally uprooted. It changed that which the Torah intended. The case of the Mitzora is the second haircut of the Mitzora is okeves. Literally, it goes around, and mosefes he. The oral tradition in regard to the Mitzora Tiglach HaSheni is not uprooting that which the Torah says. The Torah spoke about the Mitzora removing hair from certain parts of his body, and the oral tradition comes along and says, don't limit yourself to those parts, but add other parts of the body. It's adding. It's not changing. In other words, in the case of the Mitzora, second haircut, he's going to be doing exactly what it says in the pasuk. You're going to see that which he's doing, practically speaking. Hair removal, for example, he's going to shave his head. The Torah says he shaves his head, es rosho. He's going to do that. He's not changing it. He simply adds. He's going to remove the hair. He's going to shave the hair off his arms also. That's not an undoing of what the Torah said. So that the example of Mitzorah is not like the case of, let's say, get. The Torah says, write the get on parchment. I'm going to have a get that is written on a piece of paper. Well, when you look at the piece of paper, there's no reflection. There's no hint of what the Torah said. That's a total uprooting. So, Mitzorah doesn't fit into the list. And therefore, as we said before, that's bad news for those who want to include Afer as being left out of the list. Rav Ashi Omar. Rav Ashi tells us, Ha masnisa moni. Rabbi Yishmael he Dorish Kloli Uproti. The Tanaic source that you notice, the first of the two diamonds, that Tanaic source which began with the words V'hoya b'yom hashvi, that is authored by Rabbi Yishmael. The Tiglachas Sheni of the Mitzorah, as being defined by Mokom Kinu Seyar Venira, the diamond that we had above, that is a source authored by Rabbi Yishmael. Let's read this in the Gemara again. Ha masnisa moni Rabbi Yishmael he dedorish kloli uproti. That's Rabbi Yishmael's approach to scriptures throughout the Torah. He has a tradition of explaining them in the klal uprat fashion. We continue at the top of Omid Beis. Kedalas moni, the second Tanaic source. You notice where we had a diamond, and then we had a source that said that the Tiglachas Sheni is to be exactly like the Tiglachas Rishon. That's Rabbi Akiva. That's authored by someone else. That's authored by Rabbi Akiva, the Dorish Ribui Umiuti, who explains Psukim using a different form of derivation. It's called the Ribui Umiut method, which, at the end of the day, without getting into details, it's quite a long topic in and of itself, but at the end of the day, the Ribui Umiut fashion will be more inclusive than the Klal Uprat fashion. The statement made by Shmuel, that was quoted before, of Halacha Oikeves Mikra, that was taught by Rabbi Yishmael. Mitzorah, the ability to see by Mitzorah, Halacha Oikeves Mikra, well, that would be if you hold by Rabbi Akiva's approach. So we don't see Mitzorahs as being. We don't see any manifestation by Mitzorah of that actually happening, of Halacha Oikeves Mikra. The only way to have seen that is to assume that the source of the Las is authored by the same one who authored Mokom Kinus Seir Venira, and that the Las is uprooting the Mokom Kinus Seir Venira requirement. But they're authored by two different people. And here the Gemara gives us the background, the Sanya, the background to what we just said, namely that there is the other approach of darshaning those psukim in the Ribui Umiut fashion. And we're going to see the difference between the two approaches very shortly. The Sanya. Again, a source dealing with the Mitzorah. And by the way, if you would skip this section, you see the Gemara comes to the issue of my havi Allah. So that up till this point, we've essentially rejected Afer. There, the Gemara asks, my havi Allah, what should we do practically? Can we include Afer or not? The Gemara will answer, don't include it. I don't want to confuse anybody, but there is a question that Tosfos at the top, it's a short Tosfos, he raises the question that why in the world does the Gemara have to bother asking my havi Allah when it would seem that the Gemara came to a conclusion by the last inverted volcano shape. where you see we have this long marking, so we've come to a conclusion. There's nothing more to pursue. Yet the Gemara does pursue. That's an issue that Tosfos takes up. But for our purposes, let's now go into the source that the Gemara quotes here, Desanya. Once again, we're dealing with the Tiglachas Sheni of the Mitzorah, and we're going to darshan it, the psukim, in a ribui umiut fashion. Desanya. V'hoya b'yom hashvi yigalach es kol saro. And on the seventh day of the purification week, the Mitzorah shaves off all his hair. Riba. That's inclusive. Es rosho v'es zikono v'es gabos einov. That is mi'et, exclusive. In other words, it's excluding all other parts of the body. It's saying he removes the hair only from Rosh Zikono and Gabos Einov. V'ez kol sairo yigaleach chozav riba. Once again, an inclusive expression. Structurally, then, what do we have? Riba umi'et v'riba riba hakol. Well, when you have this, we'll say you've got to include all hair to be removed. My riba de kule gufe. We're including his entire body, and that's what we meant before dalas, the bowling pin style haircut. After all, when you have a limitation expression, something must be excluded. So what does he not need to remove, hair-wise? He doesn't have to, the Mitzorah doesn't have to remove nasal hairs that are growing in his nostrils. But other than that, all hair is removed, including armpit hairs and certainly pubic hairs. Everything is removed according to Rabbi Akiva's approach. I want to emphasize even the armpit hairs and even the arm and leg hairs. Those are two examples of hair removal that Rabbi Shmuel, who darshan in the Pratu Klal fashion, would not have required. Rabbi Akiva does require. My Havi Allah. What is to be our conclusion? In the case of no dirt, by the Sotah, can you use ash? Ta Shma. We answer. The Omer of Huna Barashi Omar Rav. Ein Shom Ofar. If they find themselves in the Sotah process and not having any dirt available, maybe Rakvuvis Yerek Umekadesh. They bring some decomposed vegetable matter. If you leave vegetables out long enough, they'll inevitably dry up, decompose, and turn into some, let's say, granular type substance. You can bring that, umekadesh, kash means, and add that to the water. And we infer now from what Rav Huna just taught. We're skipping two words. Rashi does not include the two words, and that's why we have them in, we bracket them out. And we infer Rakvuvis Yerek hu dahavoi ofar. Rakvuvis Yerek qualifies as a replacement for ofar. Efer lo havoi ofar. But ash does not. So as we indicated with our markings, hopefully you're able to follow this discussion back and forth, and you see how the Gemara concludes, Efer is unacceptable. A quote from the Mishnah, Kadeshi Ro al Hamayim, the amount of ofar, of dirt, that is added to the water in the Sotah process, is an amount that should be visible when added to the water. It should be visible on the surface of the water. Tonu Rabbanan, Shloishot Srichim Shira. There are three examples of substances that need to be visible. Ofar Sotah, the example of dirt in the case of the Sotah water. V'efer Pora, the ash of the Poraduma. When the ash of the Poraduma is added to the water, the Mayim Chayim, the water drawn from a live spring, in the case of the ash water preparation, there has to be enough ash that's added that it's visible. And V'roik Yavama, the Yavama is the sister-in-law of a man, brother of her husband. Her husband died leaving no children. The surviving brother-in-law is given the option of either marrying her, that's called a yibum marriage, And if the Yibum, the Yavam, doesn't want to marry her, they do Chalitza, whereby she removes a shoe from his foot, and there is a spitting that she does. That's the rok. The rok is the saliva, the spittle that she spits in front of the brother-in-law that doesn't want to marry her. That rok has to be visible to the judges, to the dayanim that are standing witnessing this process. Mishum Rabbi Shmuel Amru Af Dam Tzipor. In the name of Rabbi Shmuel, there is added the blood of the bird. This is a reference to, once again, the Metzora purification process, whereby a bird is slaughtered over a receptacle containing water, and the amount of water that's used is a revius of water, and the blood that comes from the bird, when slaughtered over the water, that blood must be visible. The Rashi, a few lines up from here in the Rashi, Afdam tzipor shel mitzor sheshochto el kli cheres al mayim chayim v'tzorch shelo yitain mayim el kishiur she'edam tzipor nikur behen. One has to be careful to use an amount of water, not too much, an amount of water that the blood coming from this little bird that's slaughtered will be noticeable. We want the redness of the blood to be noticeable in the water. If you have too much water, the blood will simply be diluted within the water. You won't notice it. My taimo de Rabbi Yishmael. What is the basis for Rabbi Shmuel and his adding dam tzipor of the Metzora? Tichtiv. The pasuk says, we have on the side of the Gemara, by the way, this is from Vayikra Perek Yudalid, pasuk Vov. On the side of the Gemara, we've included pasuk Hey as well. Let's read it together. Vayikra Yudalid pasukim Hey and Vov. Before we continue in the Gemara text, we're looking at the side, and we're dealing with the Metzora purification. It says, V'tziva HaKohen v'shochad es hatzipor ho'achas el kli cheres al mayim chayim. The Kohen instructs, and a bird is slaughtered. One of the two birds. There's two birds brought in the Metzora process. This is a reference to the slaughtering of one bird over the clay vessel that contains water from a live spring. Es hatzipor pasuk Vav es hatzipor achaya yikach oisa. The other bird, the one that remains alive that you do not slaughter, that's called the tzipor chay, the living bird. You take it, v'es eitz ho'erez, v'es shniya tolas, v'es ho'ezov, three other elements. You take them, v'tov al oisam, v'es hatzipor chay b'dam hatzipor hashchuta al hamayim achayim. You immerse these four elements in the blood-water mixture, and that's then there's sprinkling is done. That is what is relevant to our Metzora discussion. So now let's go into the Gemara text. We asked, according to Rabbi Shmuel, how does he know to add the case of dam tzipor? Dichtiv. The pasuk says, "V'toval oisam bedam tzipor," and you saw that in pasuk Vav. V'tanya bedam. The pasuk says bedam. Yochol bedam v'lo b'mayim. Does that mean that the dipping is in blood and not in water? Talmud lomar mayim. The pasuk also speaks about al hamayim hachayim. Well, I mayim yochol b'mayim v'lo b'dam. If water then is the substance into which the dipping takes place, is it water and not blood? Talmud lo b'dam. The pasuk also says in blood. Ha ketzad. So how do you resolve these points? Maybe mayim shedam tzipor nikor behem. You bring water, an amount of which the blood of the slaughtered little bird will be recognizable. V'kama, what's the amount of water? Revius. That is Rabbi Shmuel's approach. The Tanakama in the source above didn't include the case of the Metzora bird. V'Rabbanan, who didn't expect the Metzora bird blood to be recognizable in the water, what do the Rabbanan do with the pasuk we just read? Hahu legufei. It's needed to teach the basic law itself. Thusly, the Torah says, "Atil b'dam u'v'mayim." You take the living bird and the other three elements and dip them into a mixture of blood and water, but no expectation that the blood has to be visible or noticeable. L'gufei, once again, that means simply the procedure that you're expected to do, without any allusion in this pasuk to the additional requirement of the blood being noticeable. For Rabbi Shmuel said that you learn from here that the blood has to be noticeable, not just present in the water, but also noticeable. In Cain, if like the Rabbanan, if not like I say, lichtov rachmana v'tova bohem, the Torah would have been able to simply say v'tova bohem. B'dam u'v'mayim lomali. Why does the Torah specify dam and mayim? It would have been understood anyway that you have water and blood. Why then do you have to specify b'dam u'v'mayim? From the context, by reading the psukim, you see that in pasuk Hey you saw, for example, that there's water from a live spring. In pasuk Vav you see that there is you have all these elements. I should point out that in pasuk Hey you also see the slaughtering of the bird over the vessel with the water. So there you've got the blood and the water alluded to. Why in pasuk Vav do you have to spell out these words? Answer l'nikar, for the requirement of it being noticeable. The Rabbanan. Well, what about the Rabbanan that don't require it? So is there not then this redundancy in the psukim? So the Rabbanan explain, I kosav rachmana v'tova bohem, had the Torah simply written v'tova bohem, relying on my knowledge of the presence of water and blood anyway, well, have amino, I would have come to an erroneous conclusion. I would have thought, hai l'chudei v'hai l'chudei, that you take the living bird and the other three elements and you dip them into blood separately and water separately. That's l'chudei, means by itself. Kosav rachmana b'dam u'v'mayim la'arvan. So in pasuk Vav it has to spell out b'dam to tell me that when you do the dipping, you're doing a dipping into blood that's mixed with the water. But once again, not that the blood has to be visible or noticeable, just that they have to be mixed. For Rabbi Shmuel, la'arvan krach rinuksiv. As far as the idea of them being mixed, that I could have derived from another pasuk. V'shochat, pasuk Hey. V'shochat es hatzipor o achas. We read in pasuk Hey where it says v'shochat hatzipor achas el kli cheres al mayim chayim. So there you see the bird is slaughtered over the water, so they're mixed. I know mixture from pasuk Hey. I don't need the reference in pasuk Vav to the dam and the mayim for telling me mixture. So what's it there for? To telling, as Rabbi Shmuel says, noticeability, recognition. The Rabbanan who don't require the blood of the bird to be recognizable, had I had just pasuk Hey, have amino, I would have thought when the pasuk says v'shachar es hatzipor achas el kli cheres amayim chayim, I would have thought lishchatei somuch l'mona, slaughter the bird near the vessel containing the water, v'nin ketinu livridin, and pinch the neck arteries or veins, pinch it shut so that there's you slaughter the bird and no blood flows out, and receive the blood in a separate vessel, separate, so that from pasuk Hey I wouldn't have known, says the Rabbanan, the idea of mixture. Kamash Malan, I need pasuk Vav to tell me mixture, but pasuk Vav isn't there according to the Rabbanan to tell me noticeability. So you see the basis of this machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel and the Rabbanon regarding the dam tzipor as being a fourth example of tzrichim sheyera'u. According to the Rabbanan, it's not a fourth example, only 3 examples. We saw for Sotah, for Parah, and Roik Yavama, and Rabbi Shmuel says that in these psukim you see a 4th example, the dam tzipor of the Metzora. Bo minei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking a question that, when you look into the Meforshim a little bit more, you can see this in Tosfos. Tosfos points out that is Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah is not asking a question of mere inquiry, of curiosity, but rather he's raising a point of wonderment. Earlier in the Gemara, when we saw Rabbi Shmuel, he said that the blood of the tzipor must be recognizable, and how much water would enable the blood of the bird to be recognizable. It said a revius. If you have a revius, it's a liquid quantity, a specific liquid quantity of water, that amount, so that with that amount, anytime you slaughter a bird that qualifies as a Metzora type bird, the blood will be recognizable. Rav Yirmiyah here, and we find elsewhere in Shas, the most famous example is in the 2nd parak of Bava Basra, where he, and also the allusion is made to the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, where the rabbis state quantities, amounts, times, things in very objective fashion, unqualified objective fashion. Rabbi Yirmiyah, you find, as we said, questions some of these things from time to time, and here is another example. Above, I'm going to repeat what we said above. Above, in presenting Rabbi Shmuel, he said, if you have a revius of water, you will always be able to notice the blood of the little bird, of the Metzora bird that's slaughtered over it. The Gemara now. Boy minei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Gedola umatchis samayim. Imagine you have a large bird, so much so that the quantity of blood would push away the water. You wouldn't even notice there's any water. Or Ketana, the bird is so small, v'nitches mipnei hamayim mahu. You slaughtered the bird over the water, but you wouldn't notice the blood because of the, let's say, unbalanced ratio, so little blood relative to the water. What Rav Yirmiyah is basically saying is that how can you say in such an unqualified fashion that as long as you have a revius of water, you will always notice the blood mixed in with the water. Apparently, you'll be able to notice that there's water, and you'll also notice that there's blood mixed in. It will always be like that. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, well, it's always going to be like that. Isn't it possible that you have a large bird that you won't notice any water, or that you have a small bird and you won't notice any blood? Omar Le, Rabbi Zera says, are you questioning what the Rabbanan said above? Lav amin oloch, did I not tell you? Lo tapik nafshach lembar mihilchasa. Literally, do not take yourself out, don't exclude yourself from accepted oral traditions. But tzipor dror, when you're dealing with dror, is a wild bird. It's a reference to a type of bird that certainly the Gemara knew what they were referring to. When you're dealing with this kind of little free-flying bird, shiaru rabbanan, the rabbanan made their calculation, and ein l'cha gedola shemadachas esamayim, in the realm of tzipor dror. I'm going to just use an example, and I don't intend to say that that's what the Gemara is talking about. But if you're familiar with, imagine a sparrow. Sparrow's a variety of bird. It's a rather small, certainly not an ostrich. It's a small type of bird. And if you just imagine that's what was used in the Metzora process, the rabbis made their calculations based on sparrows. There's no sparrow large enough that it would overpower, push away the water, that it would render the water unrecognizable. If you have a revius of water, there isn't such a thing as such a large sparrow that would push away the water. V'ein l'chok tana, there's no sparrow that's so small shenitches mipnei hamayim that its blood content would not be noticeable in the water. We continue with a new discussion. On the side we have a topic heading which reads Hiktim Ofor Lamayim. If, let us say, you took the vessel, we spoke about a clay vessel, and you put the ash into the vessel before the water. Up till now, we've been assuming, we've been learning with the spirit of the dirt being added to the water. So the water was already there. What about switching the order around? And we're going to speak about two topics. One, Aleph, Sotah, and Beis, Pora. Pora is the Pora Aduma, where ash, not dirt, but ash is added to water for the ash water mixture used for the tahara of tumas meis. The Gemara, Tonu Rabbanan, Hiktim Ofar Lamayim, Posel, Rabbi Shimon Machshir. Here we have a machlokas tanoim. According to the Tanakama, if you put the dirt in first and then the water for the sotah, it's unfit, it's unqualified, it's disqualified. And Rabbi Shimon says that's okay, the order is not binding. Before we go further, we glance together at the Rashi, about halfway down the page, or maybe a little more. Hiktim Ofor Lamayim Basota Posel, Kireftiv, Posuk in Bamidbar Parakeh, Posuk Yudzayin. It says V'nosan El Hamayim. You put the dirt in the water. Almo Mayim Bereisha. The water is there first, and you're adding the dirt to the water. Uksiv, and Bamidbar Parakeh, Posuk Lamed, it says V'osolo HaKohen is Kol Hatur Hazos. And from this pasuk we learned that you have to follow the order as written in the parsha. We go now back to the Gemara. My taimo the Rebbe Shimon. By having learned the Rashi, we understood the reasoning behind the Tanakama. What's the basis for Rebbe Shimon telling us that the order is not binding? Dichtiv. Notice we have a long answer. Following this long answer, the Rabbanan will then reappear. What's their response? So what's the basis of Rabbi Shimon? Dichtiv, the pasuk by Pora Aduma. Now we're going to be weaving in and out, back and forth between the topics of Sotah and Pora Aduma. By Sotah, dirt is added to water. In the case of Pora Aduma, ash is mixed with water. What does it say by Pora Aduma? V'lokho latamei me'afar sreifas achatos. You will take for the defiled from the ash of the burnt heifer. We made reference to this on a previous occasion, that the word ofar, we say at the beginning of our shiur today, when we're discussing can afer be used in lieu of ofar, so we saw a reference to this pasuk that here it's clearly talking about ash, and yet the word ofar is used. Vitanya, Omar Rabbi Shimon. V'chi ofar hu. When you read this pasuk in Bamidbar Perek Yutes, is it really ofar? It says you'll take for the defiled dirt, but you're not taking dirt. Follow afer hu. It's ash. You burnt the Pora Aduma. You burnt the red heifer. Well, Shino hakosu b'mashmo lodun heimenu gezero shava. The Torah is switched. It changed from what it should have said, or what its simple meaning would have been, and used a different word in order to use this as a basis for a word comparison, for Gezerah Shava. In other words, we're going to end up comparing two topics, Pora Aduma and Sotah. Nemar kan ofar. It says by Pora Aduma you see the word ofar. The Nemar lahalon in Sotah it says ofar. Ma lahalon, just like by the Sotah, ofar agabi mayim. we saw that referred to in Rashi before, V'nosan el hamayim. Afkan, so too by the Porah, ofar al gabi mayim. The ash is added to the water. Umakan hiktim ofar lamayim kosher. And by Porah, if you happen to switch the order, which the Gemara will point out where I know that from, but if by Porah, where I see, if you switch the order and put the ash in before the water, it's acceptable. Aflalon, so too by the Sotah, hiktim offer lamayim kosher. If you put the dirt in before the water, it will be acceptable. And by the way, this is of course Rebbe Shimon, and the opinion of Rebbe Shimon is that which we are analyzing right now. The Hasam Minalon, and by Porah, how do you know that if you put the ash in first, it's okay? Answer: Trei Kroi Ksivi. There are two psukim. Ksiv olav. One pasuk says V'nosan olav mayim. That translates as you place upon it the water. Well, so then what was there first? Almo Efer Beresha. That indicates that the ash is there first, and upon that I'm putting water. Uksiv Mayim Chayim El Keli. The pasuk says that Mayim Chayim, the water from the live spring, goes directly into the vessel. There's nothing else there in the vessel before the water. The water goes directly into the vessel. Almo Mayim Beresha. So you see that water is put in first. So make up your mind. Ha Ketzad, how do you resolve these two psukim within Porah Duma? Rotza Zeh Noisein, Rotza Zeh Noisein. In fact, whichever one you want to put in first, it's okay. V'Rabbanan. Now, what about the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan don't say whichever you want to put in first is okay. The Rabbanan actually say that changing the order, even by Porah Duma, is unacceptable. Just like they said by Sotah it's unacceptable, by Porah it's also unacceptable. So the Rabbanan tell you, El Keli Dafka, the pasuk that says Mayim Chayim El Keli, that is the binding pasuk. That is the exact way to do things. Namely, first water. The other pasuk, which said V'nosan olav mayim, that olav is le'arvon. That's to tell me that after you add the ash to the water, it's to be mixed. The ema olav dafka, maybe we can suggest to the contrary, that olav is that which is specific, namely that ash is put in first, and then you add the water to the ash. And el keli, that tells me shetehei chiyusan bekli, that the water that's used for the Porah Duma, it's water from a live spring, that it is drawn in that very vessel that the ash is in already from before. The Rashi, we have a little star, so you can go immediately to the point we want to read in the Rashi. Shelo yitol min hamayan b'kli acher v'yitain l'tzoch zeh. That this would be telling me you don't draw the water in another vessel and pour it into this. Elo b'kli zeh yishavem min hamayim. But rather, with this vessel that had the ash in it from before, you draw the water. Maybe that's the way to go. The Gemara says no. Ma motzinu b'chol makom. What do we find in all places? And when he says all places, Rashi says, what do we find, for example, in the case of Sotah? Machshir lamala. We saw Rashi above, the Rashi that we read at the beginning of this section of the Gemara. The pasuk had said, "V'nosan el hamayim." You put the ash into the water. The ash makes the water effective. So that's called the machshir. It's the catalyst for making the water effective. So that just like we find in the case of Sotah, the machshir lamala, the dirt is put above, on top of the water. Afkan, so too by the Porah, machshir lamala. The ash is to be put on top of the water. And that's how the Rabbanon deal with the Psukim. Rabbi Shimon, of course, saw flexibility. The V'nosan olav mayim chayim el keli, olav mayim, that you put the ash on the water, and then mayim chayim el keli. That is, v'nosan olav mayim means that, I should say, let me correct myself. That would indicate, according to Reb Shimon, you're putting the water on the ash, and mayim chayim el keli, the mayim chayim is first there, and you'd be putting the ash on top of the water. Either way, that's Rabbi Shimon. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.